Most relationships don't break because of betrayal or obvious cruelty. They unravel in silence, in moments that feel small, in pressure you can't quite name. I remember the feeling clearly, being uneasy, without evidence, controlled without commands, slowly reshaped, without a single argument. Nothing dramatic was happening, yet something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface. What I eventually understood changed how I see relationships forever. There are psychological forces at work that don't announce themselves. They operate below awareness, not as evil intentions, not as conscious manipulation, but as automatic patterns, biological programs. And here's the part most men miss: these patterns only work when they find something weak to attach to. This story isn't about blaming women. It's about understanding why so many men lose themselves while trying to love well. Once you see how these dynamics function, you stop fighting shadows. You become immune, calm, grounded, unmovable. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. And if you value conversations that cut through illusion without noise, you're welcome to subscribe. I didn't understand any of this at first. I thought the tension I felt meant I was failing as a partner. I assumed the confusion was my fault, that if I paid closer attention, adjusted myself more carefully, or tried harder to be understanding, the unease would disappear. That belief kept me stuck longer than I should have been. Because the problem wasn't effort, it was ignorance. What I eventually learned is uncomfortable, but it's precise. Many relationship dynamics are not driven by conscious intention. They're driven by biology. Deep old programs that evolved long before modern dating, long before language was refined enough to describe them. These programs don't ask for permission. They don't announce themselves. They run automatically, responding to environmental cues the way a reflex responds to pain. When a woman pulls away emotionally, she is often not making a strategic decision. She isn't sitting somewhere planning control. Her nervous system is responding. When she expresses disappointment in a way that makes you feel responsible for her emotions, it's not always manipulation in the villainous sense. It's conditioning that has worked for thousands of generations. And when you feel yourself bending, adapting, apologizing for things you can't clearly identify, that isn't weakness of character. It's a predictable response to pressure that targets male psychology. The mistake men make is moralizing these behaviors. They frame them as good or bad, right or wrong. That framing misses the point. Biology doesn't care about morality. It cares about outcomes. These patterns evolved because they produced results. They filtered men. They selected for certain psychological traits. Over time, what worked remained. Here is the truth that changes everything: these tactics do not work on all men. They only work on men who are internally unstable, men whose sense of worth is external, men whose emotional balance depends on approval, closeness, or reassurance. The behavior adapts to the weakness it finds. No weakness, no leverage. Once I saw that, I stopped taking things personally. The confusion I felt was not proof that I was doing something wrong. It was proof that something was being tested, not consciously, automatically. My emotional reactions were data. My boundaries were data. My ability to remain centered under pressure was data. This is where most men misunderstand relationships. They believe the goal is harmony at all costs, smoothness, emotional consistency. But biology doesn't optimize for comfort. It optimizes for survival and long-term outcomes. From that perspective, emotional pressure is not cruelty. It is evaluation. Women evolved to assess whether a man could remain stable under stress. Not theoretical stress, emotional stress, ambiguity, uncertainty, pressure without explanation. A man who collapses psychologically when the emotional environment becomes unstable is not a safe bet for leadership protection or long-term reliability. That evaluation doesn't require conscious thought. It happens through feeling response and pattern recognition. This is why reasoning your way out of these dynamics rarely works. You're not dealing with logic. You're dealing with a system that reads behavior, not explanations. You can explain your intentions perfectly and still fail the test. Because the test is not about what you say. It's about what happens to you internally when pressure is applied. I used to believe that better communication would fix everything. That if I explained how I felt clearly enough, calmly enough, the dynamic would shift. Sometimes it did briefly, but it always returned, stronger, more refined. Because consciousness does not override biology, it adapts it. The more you try to negotiate with unconscious patterns, the more sophisticated they become. The system doesn't stop testing, it just changes the method. That's why men who pride themselves on emotional intelligence are often the most exhausted. They keep engaging at the wrong level. The correct response is not confrontation, it's immunity. Immunity doesn't mean emotional shutdown. It doesn't mean indifference. It means your internal state no longer moves in response to pressure designed to provoke movement. When withdrawal doesn't create anxiety, withdrawal loses its function. When guilt doesn't trigger self-blame, guilt loses leverage. When inconsistency doesn't create craving, inconsistency becomes irrelevant. This is why the focus must never be on changing her behavior. You cannot out-argue evolution. You cannot educate unconscious programming out of existence. What you can do is remove the conditions that allow it to operate. Every manipulation pattern, no matter how subtle, requires one thing: your participation, not your consent, your emotional engagement. The moment your nervous system stops reacting the way the pattern expects, the pattern fails. That realization was humbling, because it meant the common denominator across my experiences wasn't women. It was me, my need for clarity, my discomfort with emotional ambiguity, my tendency to interpret distance as danger. Those traits made me predictable, and predictability is control. Once I stopped framing these dynamics as personal, I could see them clearly. The silence wasn't an attack. It was a probe. The disappointment wasn't an accusation. It was a lever. The affection wasn't just warmth. It was reinforcement. None of it required malice to function. This perspective doesn't make you cynical. It makes you precise. You stop asking, "Why is she doing this to me?" and start asking, "What is this behavior measuring?" And more importantly, what is it revealing about me? That question is uncomfortable because it removes the victim narrative. But it also returns power, because what's being evaluated can be strengthened. Psychological stability is not fixed. Independence can be built. Emotional self-sufficiency can be trained. When those traits develop, something counterintuitive happens. The behaviors that once felt manipulative lose their emotional charge. You notice them without reacting. You remain present without chasing. You stay grounded without withdrawing. And in that state, the entire dynamic shifts. Some women respond to that shift by escalating pressure. Others relax. That response tells you everything you need to know. But that comes later. Before you can interpret her reaction, you have to understand the mechanisms themselves. Because once you see the structure, you stop being confused by the experience. And confusion is the entry point for control. The The first pattern I learned to recognize was withdrawal, not the dramatic kind. No slammed doors, no declarations of anger, just distance, silence, a subtle cooling that arrives without explanation. One day everything feels normal. Conversation flows. There is warmth, shared presence. Then without warning, the temperature drops. Her responses shorten, eye contact fades. She seems distracted inward, unreachable. When you ask what's wrong, you get nothing useful. I'm fine. I'm just tired. Nothing. The words are neutral, but the absence behind them is loud. This is where the psychological pressure begins. Your mind reacts immediately, not logically, instinctively. Something has changed, and you don't know why. Your brain searches for cause. You replay recent conversations. You scan your behavior. You look for mistakes. Did I say something wrong? Did I miss something important? Was I insensitive without realizing it? The lack of information becomes the problem, and your nervous system fills the gap with anxiety. That anxiety drives action. You reach out more. You become attentive. You soften your tone. You offer reassurance. You apologize preemptively. Sometimes you apologize without knowing what you're apologizing for. You adjust your behavior in hopes of restoring the emotional baseline. You are not responding to a request. You are responding to uncertainty. This is not random. And it is not punishment in the way men usually interpret punishment. Withdrawal functions as a test, an unconscious one. It measures what happens to you when emotional access is restricted. Does your center hold or does it collapse? Do you remain grounded or do you chase relief? The behavior itself is less important than your response to it. From a biological perspective, withdrawal creates scarcity, and scarcity increases perceived value. Attention that was once available now feels precious. Approval that was once assumed now feels threatened. When her warmth eventually returns, it feels earned. Relief replaces clarity. The nervous system remembers that relief, and the cycle gains strength. Most men misunderstand this dynamic because they personalize it. They assume the withdrawal means something about their worth, or the state of the relationship, or her level of attraction. But withdrawal is not primarily about you. It is about control of emotional rhythm. When you pursue during withdrawal, you signal something specific. You demonstrate that your emotional stability depends on her access, that her presence regulates your internal state, that absence destabilizes you. From an evolutionary standpoint, this information matters. A man who cannot self-regulate under emotional stress is a risk, not because he is bad, but because he is predictable under pressure. The more intensely you chase, the more clearly that dependency is revealed. And dependency invites leverage. Women do not need to understand this consciously for it to function. The nervous system reads patterns faster than the mind can articulate them. If withdrawal produces pursuit, it gets repeated. If it produces panic, it becomes effective. If it produces indifference, it fades. This is why men who care deeply often suffer the most here. Their investment makes them responsive. Their desire to repair makes them reactive. Their empathy becomes the mechanism through which they lose position. The silence itself becomes a psychological scare tactic, not intentionally cruel, functionally effective. It keeps you alert, vigilant, focused on her emotional state. You begin to monitor her mood more closely than your own. You start managing yourself to prevent the next withdrawal. Comfort is replaced by anticipation, and anticipation is exhausting. Over time, this pattern reshapes behavior. You hesitate before speaking. You censor thoughts. You choose words carefully. You avoid topics that might create distance again. You become less authentic, not because you are lying, but because you are optimizing for emotional safety. The relationship becomes something you manage rather than inhabit. The cruel part is that none of this requires conscious malice. It emerges naturally when withdrawal works. When distance creates pursuit, biology takes note. The behavior survives because it selects. The man who remains stable during withdrawal sends a different signal. He does not escalate contact. He does not collapse inward. He notices the distance without rushing to fix it. He continues his life. His tone remains steady. His boundaries remain intact. He does not punish. He does not plead. He does not perform. This response confuses the pattern. Scarcity no longer increases value. Distance no longer creates leverage. The test produces no useful data. And without data, the behavior loses purpose. Most men cannot do this at first. Not because they are weak, but because they are untrained. Emotional ambiguity feels threatening when your sense of security is externally anchored. Silence feels dangerous when connection is the source of stability. Withdrawal feels personal when identity is intertwined with approval. That is why this pattern is so effective early on, before a man has established internal grounding, before he has developed emotional self-sufficiency, before he has learned to sit comfortably with uncertainty. Withdrawal also serves another function. It keeps the relationship from settling, from becoming too predictable, too safe, too calm. Biology does not trust comfort without proof. It tests stability repeatedly to ensure it is real. This is why the dynamic often intensifies when things are going well. Just as you begin to relax, distance appears, not because something is wrong, but because something needs to be measured. The calm itself triggers the test. Men who interpret withdrawal as rejection often overcorrect. They chase reassurance. They offer more than is asked. They give ground without knowing why. And each concession reinforces the effectiveness of the pattern. But withdrawal only controls you if you assign it meaning. The moment you stop interpreting silence as danger, the mechanism breaks. The moment you stop seeing distance as a verdict on your worth, the leverage disappears. This does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming stable. Stability under withdrawal communicates something profound. It says your emotional state is self-governed, that closeness is chosen, not required, that presence is appreciated, not demanded. This is not indifference. It is strength. And strength changes the dynamic without a word. The mistake is trying to confront withdrawal directly, asking for explanations, demanding reassurance. Those responses treat the behavior as conscious strategy. It is not. Confrontation often increases pressure because it adds emotional weight to the test. Now the system has more data. The correct response is behavioral, not verbal. You do not chase. You do not withdraw in retaliation. You remain consistent, calm, occupied, whole. When withdrawal fails to destabilize you, it stops being useful, and biology abandons what no longer works. Understanding this pattern was the first step toward clarity. Because once I saw how silence could be used to shape behavior, I stopped confusing discomfort with danger. And that shift alone restored more power than any argument ever could. The second pattern revealed itself early, long before conflicts ever appeared. At first, it felt like alignment, effortless compatibility, an almost uncanny sense of being understood. She liked the same music. She was interested in the same ideas. She shared my values, my pace, my vision for the future. Conversations flowed easily without friction. I remember thinking how rare it felt to meet someone who seemed to fit so cleanly into my inner world. That feeling is powerful. It lowers defenses. It accelerates attachment. When compatibility feels perfect, the mind stops questioning. It relaxes into certainty. You stop evaluating and start investing. What I didn't understand then was that this alignment was not static, it was adaptive. During the early phase of bonding, many women unconsciously mirror the man they are with. Not as deception, not as strategy, as instinct. Her nervous system is scanning for emotional needs and reflecting them back in a form that creates safety and attachment. She becomes what secures connection. She listens closely. She observes what excites you, what reassures you, what makes you feel understood. Then she leans into those traits. She echoes your preferences. She validates your worldview. She expresses enthusiasm for the same paths you imagine for your life. To you, it feels like destiny. To biology, it is efficiency. This mirroring serves a specific function. It stabilizes the bonding window. Early attachment is fragile. Uncertainty during this phase risks disconnection. So the system smooths differences. It minimizes friction. It maximizes perceived compatibility long enough to secure commitment. The problem arises later when commitment has been established. Once attachment is felt as secure, the mirroring relaxes. The nervous system no longer needs to maintain the same level of adaptation. Her authentic preferences begin to surface. Interests shift. Enthusiasm fades in certain areas. Values that once seemed aligned reveal differences. The shared vision becomes less clear. To the man, this feels like a bait and switch. He believes something has been taken away, that the woman he committed to is disappearing. He searches for what went wrong. He tries to restore the version of her he bonded with. But that version was never permanent. It was transitional. This is where confusion turns into frustration. Men often interpret this shift as dishonesty, as if she was pretending. But pretending requires conscious intent. What happened instead was unconscious adjustment followed by natural reversion. The system did what it was designed to do. It secured attachment. Then it stopped optimizing for acquisition and returned to baseline. The mistake is assuming compatibility was proof of permanent alignment rather than temporary convergence. This pattern destabilizes men because it undermines their sense of reality. If what felt authentic was not stable, then what can be trusted? The mind reacts by trying to reestablish certainty. You push for clarity. You revisit old conversations. You remind her of who she used to be. You frame the shift as a problem that needs fixing. But you are responding to a biological process with logic. From her perspective, nothing deceptive occurred. She didn't decide to change. She relaxed. And relaxation reveals truth. Her identity didn't fracture. It emerged. The deeper issue is that mirroring creates attachment before discernment. You bond to an image that was shaped by your own needs. And when that image dissolves, you feel misled. Not because someone lied, but because you attached too early. This pattern rewards men who are hungry for connection and punishes those who move slowly. The man who mistakes resonance for permanence invests before he verifies. He builds expectations on early harmony and feels betrayed when reality asserts itself. Once attachment is secured, leverage shifts. Differences now carry weight. Disagreements feel threatening. The man who fears losing the bond he formed with the mirrored version often suppresses his own preferences to preserve closeness. He adapts to her emerging self instead of evaluating whether the alignment still serves him. This is how imbalance forms quietly. Mirroring does not end relationships. It sets the stage for control if the man becomes attached to the illusion of perfect compatibility. He chases the return of early harmony instead of accepting the truth of difference. And chasing harmony always costs ground. There is another layer to this pattern that few men recognize. Mirroring doesn't just secure attachment, it gathers information. During the early phase, as she adapts to you, she learns what you value, what reassures you, and what you respond to emotionally. That data remains even after the mirroring fades. She now knows what makes you feel close, what makes you feel understood, what makes you invest. And that knowledge can later be used to regulate distance and closeness without conscious intent. The man who believes the early phase was the real relationship becomes trapped by memory. He compares the present to the past. He interprets normal differentiation as loss. He becomes willing to negotiate himself away to regain a feeling that was never meant to last. The grounded man responds differently. He enjoys early alignment without over-identifying with it. He treats compatibility as information, not destiny. He observes whether consistency remains once comfort replaces novelty. He does not rush commitment based on resonance alone. When mirroring fades and differences appear, he evaluates calmly. He does not attempt to restore a version of her that no longer exists. He adjusts expectations or withdraws investment if alignment no longer holds. This response interrupts the leverage mirroring can create. The early phase becomes what it was meant to be, introduction, not conclusion. Men who become destabilized by this pattern are often those who attach their sense of meaning to relational harmony. They believe being understood completes them. So when that understanding shifts, their foundation shakes. But compatibility is not identity, and resonance is not proof of permanence. Once I saw this clearly, I stopped romanticizing the early phase. I learned to let it unfold without anchoring my future to it. I allowed differences to surface without panic. And I stopped trying to preserve feelings that were designed to fade. That shift restored discernment. I could see her more clearly, and I could see myself more clearly. Mirroring loses its power when you do not confuse emotional alignment with commitment. When you understand that early harmony is a function of biology, not destiny, you stop building castles on temporary ground. And when you no longer chase the illusion of perfect compatibility, you regain the position to choose rather than cling. The third pattern was more subtle and in many ways more damaging because it disguised itself as virtue. It did not arrive as accusation or demand. It arrived as hurt, disappointment, a quiet sadness that seemed to point back at me even when no clear wrongdoing had occurred. I would notice a shift in her mood. Her energy dropped. Her voice softened. Her words carried weight without clarity. When I asked what was wrong, the answer was indirect. I just feel a little off. I didn't expect that from you. I thought you understood me better. Nothing specific, nothing actionable. Yet the implication was unmistakable. I had failed her in some way. This is where responsibility quietly transfers. Men are conditioned early to believe they are responsible for the emotional well-being of the women they care about. Protect, provide, fix. When a woman expresses pain, the instinct is immediate. You assume you caused it. And if you caused it, you must correct it. This instinct is not weakness. It is deeply ingrained. And it is precisely why this pattern works. She does not need to ask for change. She does not need to state a boundary or make a request. Your own values drive you to adjust. You search for what you did wrong. You replay events. You apologize. You offer solutions. You modify behavior to prevent the feeling from returning. Over time, this conditions you. Each time you change yourself to relieve her distress, a lesson is learned. Not consciously, but neurologically. Her discomfort becomes something you must manage. Her emotional state becomes something you must regulate. And your behavior slowly shifts to minimize the risk of triggering negative emotion, even when the cause is unclear. The most insidious part of this pattern is that it feels like love, caring, attentiveness. You believe you are being a good partner. And in isolation, each adjustment seems small, reasonable. But together, they form a system where you carry responsibility without authority. The dynamic deepens when guilt is combined with self-doubt. There were moments when something felt wrong in the relationship. A boundary crossed, a pattern emerging. When I raised these concerns, the response was emotional rather than reflective. Tears, anger, accusations of insecurity, claims that I was controlling or overthinking. The conversation would shift away from the issue I raised and toward my supposed failure as a partner. And somehow, I would end up apologizing. This is not because the concern was invalid. It is because guilt short-circuits perception. When emotional intensity spikes, your nervous system prioritizes relief over truth. You stop evaluating whether your instinct was correct and start focusing on restoring peace. This creates a dangerous loop. You learn to distrust your own perceptions. If every attempt to assert concern results in emotional backlash, you begin to silence yourself. You question your judgment. You assume the problem is you. The transfer of responsibility is complete when you feel guilty for noticing patterns. This pattern thrives on implication rather than clarity. If she stated directly what she wanted, you could evaluate it, agree or disagree, set boundaries. But when dissatisfaction is expressed without specifics, you are left to guess. And guessing keeps you engaged. Your mind becomes preoccupied with interpretation, reading between lines, anticipating moods, avoiding missteps. You become reactive rather than deliberate. From a biological standpoint, this pattern selects for compliance. A man who internalizes guilt quickly is easier to shape. His desire to be good becomes leverage. His morality becomes the tool used to guide his behavior. Again, this does not require conscious manipulation. The system operates on results. If expressing disappointment causes you to change, the behavior persists. If guilt alters your actions, guilt becomes effective. Men often resist this idea because it challenges their self-image. They believe they are choosing to adjust, choosing to care, choosing to compromise. But choice requires clarity, and clarity is absent here. True compromise involves mutual expression, mutual responsibility, mutual adjustment. What happens instead is unilateral accommodation driven by emotional pressure. The man who resists this pattern does something counterintuitive. He listens without absorbing responsibility that does not belong to him. He allows her emotions to exist without rushing to fix them. He asks for clarity calmly. And if clarity is not provided, he does not self-incriminate. This response feels cold to men who equate love with rescue. But it is not cold. It is mature. Emotions are not accusations by default. They are experiences. When you treat them as verdicts, you surrender agency. When you treat them as information, you retain it. Guilt loses power when it does not produce behavior change, when sadness does not automatically trigger self-blame, when disappointment is acknowledged without immediate correction. The man who maintains this boundary sends a clear signal. He is willing to engage, but not to be controlled. He cares, but he does not abandon himself. He listens, but he does not kneel. This pattern also reveals why many men feel drained without knowing why. Carrying emotional responsibility without authority is exhausting. You are constantly managing outcomes you cannot fully control. You are trying to regulate another person's internal state, which is impossible. Over time, resentment builds, not toward her, but toward yourself. You feel trapped by your own compliance, and that resentment corrodes intimacy. When I stopped absorbing guilt reflexively, something shifted. Conversations became clearer. Emotional displays either turned into actual communication or lost their impact. I no longer felt compelled to fix feelings that were not mine to fix. Some relationships did not survive that change. Others improved dramatically. The difference was not in the behavior itself, but in how it was received. Guilt is only effective when it bypasses your judgment. The moment you pause and ask, "Is this actually my responsibility?" the pattern weakens. Caring does not require surrendering psychological sovereignty. Love does not require you to carry emotions that are not yours. And responsibility, when misplaced, becomes control. Understanding this pattern restored trust in my own perception. And without that trust, no relationship can remain healthy for long. The fourth pattern was the one that created the strongest emotional pull, because it did not rely on silence or guilt. It relied on contrast. Intensity followed by absence. Warmth followed by cold. A cycle that never settled long enough for stability to form. At her best, she was fully present, affectionate, engaged. She listened closely, touched, often spoke with warmth. During those periods, the relationship felt secure. I felt chosen, valued, desired. There was no tension to analyze, no distance to bridge. Everything felt aligned. And then, without warning, the temperature dropped. Messages became short, responses slowed, her voice flattened, plans became uncertain. When I asked what was wrong, then the answer was always the same. Nothing. I'm just busy. It's fine. The words were calm, but the shift was unmistakable. The connection I had grown comfortable with was suddenly unavailable. This contrast was destabilizing. The human nervous system is not designed for inconsistency. It searches for patterns. It tries to predict. When affection is steady, security forms. When affection becomes unpredictable, attention spikes. You begin monitoring, waiting, hoping. The mind becomes preoccupied with restoring the previous state. This is intermittent reinforcement. When positive experiences are delivered unpredictably, they become addictive. The brain releases more dopamine, chasing a reward that might return than enjoying one that is guaranteed. The uncertainty intensifies desire, tensifies. The relief of reunion becomes disproportionately powerful. I didn't realize what was happening at the time. I just knew I felt restless when she pulled away. I would reach out, ask questions, suggest seeing each other. I bought gifts. I offered reassurance. I searched for whatever action might bring her warmth back. And when it worked even briefly, the relief was intense. That relief trained me. The cycle did not need to be intentional to function. Her nervous system fluctuated. My nervous system responded. When warmth returned after effort, the pattern locked in. My behavior became linked to the restoration of affection. Over time, this cycle kept my attention centered on the relationship. I was not thinking about my life, my direction, or my internal state. I was thinking about her mood, her availability, the timing of the next emotional high. This is how addiction forms, without substances. The danger of this pattern is not the cold moments. It is the memory of the warm ones. The man caught in this cycle does not leave because he remembers how good it can feel. He believes that version is the real one, and the distance is an interruption. He works to eliminate the interruption rather than questioning the cycle itself. Hot and cold dynamics create dependency because the man begins regulating his emotional state through the relationship. When she is warm, he is calm. When she is cold, he is anxious. His internal balance becomes externally controlled. This is why the pattern is so powerful. It doesn't require dominance. It requires variability. Men often misinterpret this as passion. They confuse intensity with depth. They believe the emotional highs are proof of connection. But stability is not boring. Instability is stimulating. And stimulation can feel like love when the nervous system is untrained. The man who becomes immune to this pattern does something radical. He decouples his emotional state from her behavior. He enjoys warmth when it is present without depending on it. And when cold appears, he does not pursue relief. He notices. He stays steady. He does not attempt to restore intensity through effort. He allows the cycle to reveal itself without feeding it. This response feels unnatural at first. The urge to act is strong. Silence feels wrong. Inaction feels risky. But that urge is the addiction speaking. It wants the next reward. When you resist that urge, the cycle weakens. The cold periods no longer produce frantic pursuit. The warm periods no longer feel like salvation. The contrast loses meaning. Hot and cold only works when you assign significance to fluctuation. There is another layer to this pattern that men rarely consider. Emotional inconsistency also tests tolerance. It measures how much instability you will endure to maintain access to affection. A man who tolerates extreme swings demonstrates high investment and low boundaries. A man who does not adjust his center demonstrates self-regulation. Again, this is not moral. It is diagnostic. Women who rely heavily on this pattern often escalate when it stops working. The warmth becomes more intense. The cold becomes more severe. The swings widen. This escalation is not conscious strategy. It is the nervous system increasing signal strength to regain effect. Men who misinterpret escalation as passion get pulled deeper. Men who recognize it as testing step back. When I stopped responding to emotional temperature changes, the dynamic shifted. The cycle either stabilized or revealed itself as unsustainable. In both cases, clarity replaced confusion. The key is understanding that affection is not a currency you earn. It is an expression that flows naturally in healthy dynamics. When it becomes conditional and inconsistent, it is no longer connection. It is leverage. Immunity does not make you less loving. It makes your love cleaner, free of compulsion, free of negotiation. You can care without craving. You can engage without being controlled. Once the nervous system learns that inconsistency does not move you, the pattern dissolves. And what remains is either genuine connection or nothing at all. Both outcomes are preferable to addiction. The fifth and sixth patterns were quieter on the surface, but no less influential. They did not rely on distance or emotional swings. They relied on suggestion and overwhelm, influence without command, pressure without force. The fifth pattern was indirect influence. Instead of asking for what she wanted, she planted ideas, casual comments, stories, observations that seemed harmless in isolation. I saw this place online. It looks amazing. My friend's boyfriend surprised her last week. She was so happy. I've never had anyone do something like that for me. None of these statements were requests. There was no demand, no expectation stated outright. But the message landed anyway. Because men are conditioned to communicate directly, implication bypasses resistance. You don't feel controlled. You feel inspired. You tell yourself the idea was yours. You act not because you were told to, but because you want to. That sense of choice is what makes the pattern effective. Over time, you begin anticipating these suggestions. You look for opportunities to deliver what was implied. You adjust plans. You spend money. You make gestures. And because the request was never explicit, you cannot negotiate. You cannot say no without feeling unreasonable. After all, she never asked. This pattern exploits a difference in communication styles. Men tend to express needs directly. Women often express them relationally, through context, through implication. When you treat implication as obligation, you give up agency without realizing it. Again, this does not require conscious manipulation. If indirect suggestion produces desired outcomes, the behavior persists. The nervous system learns that implication works better than instruction. The sixth pattern is love bombing. This one is obvious in hindsight and nearly invisible in the moment. In the early phase, affection arrives fast and heavy. Compliments escalate quickly. Connection deepens rapidly. The pace feels accelerated but intoxicating. You're different. I've never felt this way before. I don't usually open up like this. I think I'm falling for you. I love you. Each step intensifies the bond. And because the warmth feels genuine, you accept it as truth. This is not deception. During early bonding, her brain is flooded with chemicals that amplify connection. She feels intensely, and she expresses that intensity outward. The problem is not the affection itself. It is the speed. Love bombing creates emotional overwhelm. You do not have time to evaluate. You do not have space to observe consistency. The bond forms before discernment can occur. By the time intensity naturally decreases, attachment is already established. And when the intensity fades, you don't interpret it as normalization. You interpret it as loss. You begin chasing the early phase. You compare every interaction to the initial high. You wonder what changed, and you work to restore a state that was never sustainable. This gives enormous power to memory. The early phase becomes the standard, and anything less feels like failure. You become willing to tolerate confusion, distance, and inconsistency because you believe the real relationship exists somewhere behind it. Love bombing does not trap you through pain. It traps you through nostalgia. Beyond these primary patterns, there are additional variants that operate through the same mechanisms. The subtle guilt trip appears when she agrees to something you suggest, then later expresses disappointment that it wasn't what she wanted. She never stated her preference. But you are made to feel responsible for not anticipating it. You apologize for not reading her mind. Sarcasm disguised as humor undermines confidence while preserving deniability. A cutting remark is framed as a joke. If you react, you are told you are too sensitive. The comment lands anyway. The damage is done quietly. The silent treatment withdraws communication entirely. Messages go unanswered. Physical proximity disappears. There is no explanation. No boundary stated, just absence. The goal is not clarity. It is punishment without confrontation. Withholding intimacy follows the same logic. Affection disappears after something doesn't go her way. Fatigue, headaches, disinterest. The timing reveals the function. Intimacy becomes conditional. The "it's your fault" pattern assigns responsibility for her emotions to you regardless of cause. If she is unhappy, you failed. If she is stressed, you didn't support her correctly. Her internal state becomes your job. The never wrong pattern refuses accountability. Every disagreement ends with you conceding. Not because you are wrong, but because resolution requires surrender. Modern technology amplifies all of this. Texting allows withdrawal through delayed responses. Social media enables suggestion through curated images. Dating apps create implied abundance that can be used to generate insecurity. Read receipts, seen messages, story views. Every digital tool becomes a lever. The same biological programs that once operated face-to-face now operate constantly, quietly, efficiently. At this point, many men become angry. They hear these patterns and conclude relationships are adversarial, that women are manipulative by nature, that trust is impossible, that conclusion is a mistake. These behaviors are not evidence of cruelty. They are evidence of unconscious systems doing what they evolved to do. Just as men are not morally corrupt for responding to visual cues of youth and fertility, women are not morally corrupt for responding to cues of psychological strength and stability. The problem is not the existence of these patterns. The problem is vulnerability to them. Reasoning with them rarely works because you are not dealing with conscious choice. You are dealing with reflex. Awareness does not disable reflex. It adapts it. The solution is not trying to eliminate these behaviors. It is removing their leverage. When suggestion does not move you, implication stops. When emotional overwhelm does not accelerate, attachment intensity slows. When guilt does not alter behavior, guilt loses function. This requires internal strength, not dominance, not control, stability. You must build a life so full that relational pressure feels small by comparison. You must become comfortable enough with solitude that companionship is optional. You must develop self-respect strong enough that approval becomes a bonus, not a requirement. When that foundation exists, these patterns reveal their true nature. Not weapons, tests. And tests only work when you react. Once I stopped reacting blindly, a larger structure became visible. The patterns were not random. They were not isolated behaviors. They formed a system, a continuous evaluation process that never truly turns off. This is where most men get the framing wrong. They believe these dynamics are about control in the moral sense, about power plays, about winning or losing. But biology does not care about dominance the way the ego does. It cares about assessment, about filtering, about determining what kind of man stands in front of it. From that perspective, these behaviors are not attacks. They are diagnostics. Every instance of withdrawal measures emotional regulation. Every guilt trigger measures boundary strength. Every hot and cold cycle measures tolerance for instability. Every suggestion measures susceptibility to influence. The system is always asking the same question in different forms. Does this man remain himself under pressure? This explains why reasoning fails. You cannot argue with a test. You cannot persuade a scale to show a different weight. The system does not respond to explanations. It responds to outcomes. Your internal state under stress is the only answer it accepts. This is why conversations that aim to fix these dynamics often make them worse. When you explain how something makes you feel, you add emotional data. When you argue for fairness, you reveal investment. When you seek reassurance, you confirm dependency. The system absorbs all of it. Men who pride themselves on communication often misunderstand this. They believe clarity dissolves tension, But clarity does not neutralize biological evaluation. It refines it. The system simply learns which buttons produce which responses. This is the moment where many men try the wrong solution. They attempt to make the woman conscious of her behavior. They point out patterns. They hope awareness will create change. But consciousness does not override biology. It reorganizes it. Once a woman becomes aware that certain behaviors influence you, those behaviors either become more subtle or more intense. The function remains, only the form adapts. The correct response is not exposure, it is immunity. Immunity does not mean ignoring behavior. It means the behavior no longer changes who you are or how you move. You observe without reacting. You engage without destabilizing. You care without surrender. When immunity is present, something important happens. The system receives no usable data. Pressure produces no movement. Tests return neutral results. At that point, the dynamic reaches a fork. Some women escalate. When subtle tactics stop working, intensity increases. Withdrawal lasts longer. Emotional displays become louder. Accusations become sharper. The nervous system is not choosing escalation. It is panicking. Its primary tools are failing, so it increases signal strength. This escalation is revealing. A woman who cannot tolerate loss of leverage prioritizes control over connection. She needs influence to feel safe. When influence disappears, anxiety rises, and anxiety manifests as pressure. Other women adapt. When tactics stop working, they relax. They communicate more directly. They stop testing as frequently. The relationship stabilizes, not because manipulation was defeated, but because it became unnecessary. This distinction matters more than compatibility. The woman who escalates reveals a character structure built on control. The woman who adapts reveals capacity for partnership. And you do not need to interrogate this difference. Your immunity surfaces it naturally. Understanding this changes how you interpret behavior. You stop asking, why is she doing this, and start asking, what happens when it doesn't work? The answer tells you everything. This is why emotional neutrality is so powerful, not indifference. Neutrality. Indifference communicates lack of care. Neutrality communicates strength. You remain present, engaged, but unmoved by pressure designed to move you. From a biological standpoint, this is the signal of leadership. Leadership is not dominance. It is stability under uncertainty. The ability to remain oriented when others lose orientation. The ability to hold frame when emotional weather changes. Women are not evaluating men based on kindness alone. They are evaluating capacity. A man who collapses under emotional strain cannot be trusted with greater responsibility, not because he is bad, but because he is brittle. This is why these tests persist even in long-term relationships. Life introduces pressure, loss, stress, ambiguity. A man who cannot handle relational pressure is unlikely to handle external pressure well either. Seen through this lens, the testing makes sense. The irony is that men who are most vulnerable to these dynamics are often the ones who care the most. Their investment becomes exposure. Their empathy becomes leverage. Their desire to preserve connection becomes the very thing that destabilizes them. But caring does not require collapse. You can care deeply without surrendering psychological sovereignty. You can love without outsourcing your center. You can commit without making approval a requirement for stability. When you develop this capacity, relationships change. Not because women become different, but because the environment changes. Pressure finds nothing to grab onto. The system recalibrates. Some tests disappear entirely, others become faint. The ones that remain are no longer threats. They are signals, and signals can be interpreted calmly. This is the point where many men realize something unsettling. The chaos they experienced was not inevitable. It was conditional. Conditional on their internal structure. That realization is uncomfortable because it removes the excuse of helplessness. But it also returns agency. You cannot stop the tests, but you can stop failing them. When you do, the relationship either matures or dissolves. And both outcomes are victories. Because clarity is always better than confusion. Once immunity begins to form, the dynamic enters its most revealing phase. This is the stage where behavior no longer hides behind subtlety. The system responds to resistance, and resistance produces contrast. When a man stops reacting the way he used to, the environment changes. Emotional pressure that once created movement now meets stillness. Tactics that once worked now fall flat. From the outside, nothing dramatic has changed. From the inside, everything has. This is where the escalation pattern appears. If withdrawal once lasted hours, it now lasts days. If guilt was once implied, it becomes explicit. If affection once fluctuated gently, it now swings between extremes. The nervous system is not negotiating. It is attempting to restore control. This escalation is often misinterpreted. Men think she's getting worse, or she's becoming more manipulative. But that interpretation assumes conscious intent. What is actually happening is closer to a biological emergency. A system that relied on influence detects failure. It increases intensity to compensate. Understanding this prevents emotional misreading. You stop personalizing the escalation. You stop interpreting it as cruelty or malice. You see it as information. The response to escalation reveals everything about the woman's psychological structure. Some women escalate until they exhaust themselves. They increase pressure, create drama, and attempt to provoke reaction. When none arrives, they feel unsafe. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because their identity is tied to influence. Without leverage, they feel exposed. These women often frame your stability as emotional distance. They accuse you of being cold, detached, or uncaring. This is projection. They confuse lack of control with lack of affection. Other women respond differently. When escalation fails, they pause. They observe. They recalibrate. Instead of increasing pressure, they shift strategy. Communication becomes more direct. Emotional displays become clearer. The relationship stabilizes around mutual respect rather than leverage. This difference is not about love. It is about capacity. A woman who adapts values connection over control. A woman who escalates values control over connection. And no amount of communication can change that hierarchy. The testing does not end here, even after adaptation tests continue in subtler forms. Life introduces new stressors, work pressure, family issues, health concerns. Each stressor creates an opportunity for evaluation. Does this man remain steady? Does he hold boundaries? Does he self-regulate? These tests are not planned. They emerge naturally when uncertainty enters the environment. This is why understanding the testing framework is crucial. Without it, men interpret challenges as failures. With it, they interpret them as assessments. This reframing changes behavior. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond structurally. You maintain routine. You protect your center. You do not abandon principles under pressure. You allow discomfort without rushing to eliminate it. This is what ends manipulation. The most sophisticated aspect of these tests is their diagnostic function. They are not only trying to achieve immediate outcomes, they are gathering data. How quickly do you react? What emotions move you? How far will you bend? What threats activate compliance? Early in relationships, this data collection is intense. The system needs baseline measurements. Later, the data is updated periodically. It informs long-term decisions about respect, trust, and commitment. This explains why some women seem to create drama without reason. The drama is the test. Stress reveals structure. Pressure reveals truth. Men often sabotage themselves by treating these moments as crises. They scramble to restore peace. They abandon posture to regain comfort. And in doing so, they provide exactly the data the system is seeking. The man who remains stable during stress communicates something profound. He signals that his identity is not negotiable, that his values do not bend under emotional force, that his presence is consistent. This consistency creates safety, not emotional indulgence, structural safety. Women do not trust men who require perfect conditions to function. Life is not perfect. A man who falls apart during relational tension is unlikely to perform well during real-world adversity. This is why escalation is such a critical phase. It exposes the truth of both parties. The man who breaks reveals dependency. The woman who escalates reveals control orientation. The man who remains steady reveals leadership. The woman who adapts reveals partnership potential. Once this phase passes, the relationship reaches equilibrium. Either it stabilizes on healthier terms or it dissolves. And dissolution, when clarity is present, is not failure. It is alignment. Men often fear losing relationships more than losing themselves. This fear is what makes escalation effective. When you remove that fear, the leverage disappears. This does not mean becoming indifferent to outcomes. It means you no longer sacrifice psychological integrity to preserve connection. At this stage, many men notice something unexpected. The traits that make them immune to manipulation also improve every other area of life. Boundaries strengthen. Decision-making clarifies. Emotional regulation improves. The same stability that resists relational pressure resists workplace manipulation, social pressure, familial guilt, external control in all forms. This is not coincidence. Psychological strength is not contextual. It generalizes. The man who learns to remain centered when a woman escalates pressure can remain centered when a boss applies pressure, when a friend crosses boundaries, when society demands compliance. That is why this work matters beyond relationships. By the time escalation no longer moves you, the invisible war is over. Not because you won, but because there is nothing left to fight. The system has learned its answer. The most valuable lesson I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it matters. The most dangerous moments in life don't arrive when things are clearly falling apart. They arrive when everything looks fine on the surface, while something inside you is quietly eroding. When you give up your internal stability in exchange for approval, peace, or connection, you don't lose it all at once. You lose it slowly, in small compromises that feel reasonable in the moment. Real strength is not about control. It is about self-governance, about knowing who you are well enough that emotional pressure does not rewrite your values. Love should not require you to abandon your judgment. Caring should not demand that you carry responsibilities that are not yours. A healthy relationship does not ask you to shrink so that it can feel safe. The truth is, the world will always test you. Through people, through circumstances, through uncertainty. Those tests are not there to break you. They are there to reveal whether you are anchored to something solid or dependent on something fragile. When your sense of worth comes from within, manipulation loses its power. Pressure becomes information instead of threat. and connection becomes a choice, not a need. If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your perspective. What part of this felt familiar? What challenged the way you see relationships or yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value conversations that cut through confusion and focus on clarity, strength, and truth, consider subscribing to the channel. Quiet growth begins with honest reflection.